Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and I'm the director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And this is a series of interviews we're doing on empathic parenting. And I'm so glad to have Robbyn Peters Bennett here to talk about empathy and parenting. Thanks, Robbyn, for joining me.
Well, it's great to be here. This is going to be a wonderful discussion, Edwin.
So just by way of introduction, you're a psychotherapist, an educator, a child advocate who specializes in the treatment of trauma-related mental health problems in early childhood stress and abuse and neglect. And you are the founder of StopSpanking.org, which is a nonprofit dedicated to educating the public on the dangers of spanking. And you have two websites that I saw. You have one, your personal one, where you do your therapy counseling. It's robbynpetersbennett.org, and then the stopspanking.org, which is just a cornucopia of resources about parenting. And so would you like to say more by way of introducing yourself?
Yeah, that's pretty thorough. One other thing so important and dear to my heart is that I'm on the board of an organization in the United States. It's called the U.S. Alliance to End the Hitting of Children. And it's an alliance that attempts to connect people from all walks of life that are doing grassroots efforts to build empathy and to reduce violence against children, particularly in the home. And
so
that's at endhittingusa.org.
Oh, okay. And you're also doing, you have your second annual No Spank Challenge, which is like a conference with, you say, like 25 experts, parenting experts. Is that like in the works now, or?
Yes, that's happening right now. And so this is Child Abuse Month, right? Every April. And at the end of April is a No Spank or Spank Out Day. It's sponsored by the Center for Effective Discipline with Gundersen Hospital. And so what we're doing is Parenting Beyond Punishment and many other educators, Lori Petro with Teach Through Love, Lives in the Balance with Dr. Ross Green and Kim Betts, and many other educators that are very interested in non-coercive, empathy-based parenting approaches have come together to help parents, with, obvious problems of, okay, I don't want to yell, I don't want to be coercive, I don't want to spank, but what do I do? So this is a month-long event with webinars and articles and that sort of thing, as well as there's a closed Facebook group that you can share struggles you're having and have clinicians and educators and helpers offer some support for parents.
So on your website, you really go into the problems of physical punishment and really lay that out, and you have a really wonderful TED Talk, and there's all kinds of videos and interviews you've been doing. So there's a lot of effort in terms of the problems on spanking and physical punishment with children. And what we wanted to talk about was kind of focusing on, like, what do you do? Like, what do parents do, and how do they create more of an empathic parenting styles? And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about that. Like, what are some of the different parenting styles out there? And the one that you're working with is positive discipline and then I've heard there's also attachment parenting, and then there's actually empathic parenting. So there's a whole kind of a spectrum of different parenting styles. I was wondering if maybe you could give a little bit of an overview of your understanding of those different approaches.
Sure. Well, I think that historically, how we have thought about parenting has been from primarily a behavioral approach. How do you help children behave? And some parents are more likely to be authoritarian and do that through punishment, through disapproval, through all sorts of rewards and punishments to coerce children to behave a certain way. And some parents are not comfortable with that, so they might be more permissive and lax and not be able to set boundaries and have difficulty creating structure. So that's more of the traditional way that we've understood children, is how do we control behavior. But there's been an evolution in that thinking over the last 20 years, if not longer, particularly with the onslaught of just the enormous body of literature coming out of neuroscience and child development on how children's brains actually grow. And from that is a different model. And so all of these models, attachment parenting, empathy-based, peaceful parenting, positive discipline, I think they all fall under, excuse me, an umbrella of attachment, relationship-oriented parenting. And so that form of parenting is basically saying you have to keep your long-term goals in sight, because you don't want to get caught up in the distress of the moment and be overly reactive. You have to learn how to provide warmth so that a child feels loved and appreciated, and that they feel your affection. And also structure, meaning information about how does the world work, what are the rules of the environment, how do things happen, how do I get enough information to make good decisions. And then you have to understand, how does a child think and feel? And that's, what kind of thoughts do they have? How much can they understand things cognitively? How do they feel on an emotional level? And also, really important for little children, who we tend to spank the most, is how do they feel on a physical level? How do we build in healthy sensory experience so children are regulated? And then the last piece is, how do we problem solve collaboratively? So that's the general model, I think, of all of these kinds of approaches, that some may focus more on warmth, others may focus more on structure, but they're all sort of building on these ideas that essentially are neurodevelopmentally informed. So we know, bottom line, is it's about connection, and that children do well when they can, and they do well when they're regulated, and that happens through co-regulation, not through coercion. So we have to be regulated and calm, and we have to have a good idea of how to stay connected to our children.
Well, before we started recording, I mentioned one idea I'm working on is a reality TV show along the lines of Supernanny, where instead of, Supernanny coming in with the tough love approach, that we use an empathic approach, where it's really about the relationships and building an empathy and love-based family environment. And you had some real interesting comments about Supernanny and kind of that whole history of that show. And if you could just describe your take on that program.
Sure. Well, first of all, the idea of tough love is a problem, because we mix tough and violence and aggression and coercion with love. I'd like to be thinking more in terms of safe love. How does love feel safe? Because if love feels tough, it makes children anxious, and we don't want children to be anxious. They don't do well when they're anxious. But what strikes me with Supernanny is that the idea of a nanny is, comes from, in large part, England. And, they used to call some of their most esteemed institutions, educational institutions, the nursery of the empire. And so this is a colonial concept of both, of really preparing your children to be fighters, to be defenders, rather than to be peacekeepers and peacemakers. So there's this idea of a boarding school where children, often as young as 5 to 9, would go away from their parents and live somewhere else with very strict rules and harsh disciplinarians who paddled and caned the children, and often the older children caned the younger children. This is the tradition of the boarding schools, and of course, thankfully, they're not like that anymore, but the injury to the attachment is profound to children when they leave their parents at such a young age. And Supernanny, I think, is born out of the nanny concept, where the mother is separated from the family. She may not even want to breastfeed. She is not going to have a lot of contact with the children. The nanny's the one that does all that daily affection and connection. And that's where children really bond, is with that daily affection and connection and warmth and touching and holding and laughing. So this idea that children are to be seen but not heard and not seen that much is sort of, so we see Supernanny as an evolution, but she's not totally evolved yet. She's not quite the peaceful nanny. And that's not to say that nannies can't be wonderful. They can be wonderful if they integrate into the family and they support mom and dad, but not separate the children, but rather enhance that connection.
Okay, so in terms of the empathy part, like how does empathy, how are you seeing that empathy, or the role of empathy in positive discipline and the other parenting approaches? What kind of insights do you have about that?
Well, I think for some, there's a religious idea that children are innately sinful and innately evil, even maybe. But what neuroscience is saying is that children are innately empathic, that is the fundamental neurobiological orientation of the brain, is it learns through empathy and through co-regulation, and that children have an innate need to connect, and they have an innate need to feel good with us and to enjoy us, and that the more that they are attached to their mom and their dad or their primary caregiver, whoever that person is, that is the foundation to brain development. That is the foundation to being able to self-regulate. Because if a child feels secure with you, they take cues from you in terms of how to cope with the environment. And so in the first 4 years, this self-regulatory equipment is developing, and it is primarily fed through this attachment, through this connection of unconditional regard, unconditional love. So that you don't want to withhold reward of the relationship. You want to be in it and really generate a feeling of it's you and me. You and me always are problem solving, dealing with the world, dealing with ourselves, you and me. And that sense of you and me is fundamentally how we are. We are, I think I was listening, I wish I could remember this psychologist's name. He said, he's a neuroscientist and a psychologist. He said, we essentially are our relationships. That's who we are. We essentially are. And
Yeah,
so that's...
Sorry. Well, I interviewed Marco Iacoboni, who wrote he's a neuroscientist, and he wrote the book Mirroring People. And I asked him, how do we build an empathic culture? And he felt that one of the strongest building blocks, that if people just realized that, understood mirror neurons and how mirror neurons worked, and that we are constantly mirroring each other, constantly in this empathic relationship. And if people just realized that they were not like cut off from each other, that they were kind of like not separate, disconnected beings, that were really, we can't help but be connected. It's just kind of the fundamental way that human beings are.
Yes, but I think there's also a history of trauma in our culture from so many resources, whether it's warfare, whether it's poverty, whether it's a transgenerational violence of alcoholism and abuse. And so our trust in that you and me experience has been really compromised. And I think that's why we punish, because we feel alone against our child. Now I have to control my child, rather than my child is distressed and having a lot of trouble here. This tantrum is distress, not defiance. And they're not doing well. So how can I hang in with my child and help them recover? How can I help them come back into equilibrium, come back into regulation by myself, being present, mirroring their feeling, or just being present with them, or understanding, slowing down, being with. Yeah.
So you're saying that we are in this empathic relationship, but the trauma kind of blocks that that empathic relationship, and it's like finding ways of getting past that trauma.
Yes, and I think trauma creates kind of a hyper arousal or a dissociation for a lot of people. So your level of reactivity is set higher than it should be in terms of your response to distress. And when your stress arousal is sort of operating at a higher level, then your ability to have empathy is compromised, because of course the capacity to have empathy is state dependent, meaning the higher my arousal, the lower my empathy. So the more I'm upset with my child, the less I can feel into their world, because that part of the brain just shuts down. So if I've been traumatized and I get easily distressed, easily angry, easily overwhelmed or anxious, then it's much harder to maintain that empathic connection. So part of what we're learning is, how do I stay connected to me? How do I
Mhm.
help myself with my anxiety? How do I stay regulated and calm? And really looking at that.
So we had a crash here with the software. So I'm going to recount a little bit of what we talked about before the last 5 minutes. We talked about the reality TV show Supernanny, and you talked about how the history of that model of parenting coming through from the British Empire. We talked about empathy and positive discipline. And you were saying that there's some views of childhood that children are innately sinful or selfish versus the new science of empathy that really shows that we are biologically, neurologically connected.
Yes.
And also that we are born empathic, and the trauma inhibits that empathy, and that how to start moving past that trauma. But what I thought we could go into a little bit was the different parenting approaches. And we kind of talked about that with Supernanny. We talked about that with a little bit of positive discipline. And there's these different, a few different parenting approaches, is, the tough love, laissez-faire, indulgent, positive discipline, attachment parenting, and there's even something called empathic parenting. So I thought maybe we could get a little bit of an overview of that and the role of empathy in those different parenting models or styles.
Sure. Well, I'm not really an expert on all the parenting styles. My area of expertise is in the treatment of symptoms of early abuse and neglect. But I've started to branch out more into really looking at the parenting models that are out there. And what I found is very curious, is that the modality that you use to treat children that have been traumatized is a non-violent, non-coercive model. Those are the ones that we're finding are the most useful. For example, collaborative proactive solutions is a program with Dr. Ross Green out of Harvard University. And of course, there's many others. And those modalities really are using your connection and your relationship to build trust, and to build in, and you build trust by having empathy where the child feels understood. And then you move from there to understanding what's going on inside of the child and what's motivating them, and what the behaviors they're having, and what are their triggers, and what do they have difficulty with. So it's deeply steeped in the idea of empathy and really getting into the experience of the child. And interestingly, general parenting practices in some ways have not kept up with what we've learned about in the field of trauma, but some are. So the traditional idea, is operating on sort of a preoccupation with behavior. And we had the same problem in the field of trauma, yeah? Because you have all these really outrageous behaviors that children express, and they're really hard to deal with. And so behavioralism is, how do you change the behavior through reward or punishment? That's sort of the classic sort of modality. And we found that just doesn't work with trauma, because usually in trauma, the attachment that the child has to the world, to the parents, to the loved ones in their life has been really injured. So that's where you're mending and building. I was just reading a quote by Dr. Alan Shore. He said, the brain architecture develops within the context of relationship of another brain. So neurobiology has really helped us understand that the brain is an organism of attachment and an organism of empathy. We learn through mirroring neurons. Dr. Dan Siegel talks a lot about mirroring neurons, and through co-experiencing. So I think that's really the new model. And of course, there's all these different versions shooting up, and because of course it's there's so many ways to see into this. But I think the attachment oriented and the unconditional parenting movement and the parenting beyond punishment and reward is really coming out of that knowledge, the neurobiological knowledge, and also a deeper sense of human rights of children, which I think is really post-World War II era, sensitivity to human rights violations. We're becoming much more sensitive in the world toward how we treat others, including children.
So you're saying that there was like a behaviorist model, which is like, well, how do we get the children just to do what we want in terms of just their actions? So the actions just conform to what we want. We can use different forms of manipulation, of punishments and rewards to kind of get the actions that we want. And that kind of behaviorist model compares to a newer science based on relationship. And is that kind of what you're setting up, is the understanding?
Yes, I think so, because if you start to understand how children really think and feel, and you begin to really be able to understand the meaning of the behavior, because the behavior is symptomatic. And so responding to children in a behavioral way is kind of superficial, because you're just really trying to eliminate something that's irritating you or difficult for everyone. But it doesn't really get at the deeper root of what does the behavior mean, and what does the child need, and what's going on inside of the child.
So with that model, with the empathic model, you're trying to really empathize with, okay, here's this behavior, like what is the underlying feelings associated with that? What is the needs? What are the intentions? What is the deeper roots of that experience, and really hearing and connecting with that?
Yes, and that when we hear and connect and are present with another person, they feel it. When someone gets you, right? It isn't the thing they say, it's just that they get you. They really feel you. And when someone feels me and they get me, I relax. I feel safe. So, as one of the positive parenting models I really like is Joan Durant's work out of Canada. She is a researcher that studied for 25 years the effects of physical punishment on children. And she developed a model that she's implemented all over the world called positive discipline in everyday parenting. It's very similar to some of the wonderful programs here in the States. But what's so interesting about it is that the whole model builds empathy. So there's 4 basic parts, right? The fundamental piece where you begin is having a long-term plan. And when you think about that, having a long-term plan is the big picture view, right? It's not a reactive place. It's a place of the big picture. So it puts your own mind in the right state of relaxation, of valuing the right things, because when you have the big picture, then you don't overvalue the immediate problems and you don't overreact to them. And then the second piece of it is to provide warmth and structure. And don't we all love that? I love structure. I love to know I can predict what you're going to do. I like to predict what's going to happen. I want to know how things work. I want to understand what you need so that I know how to respond to you. And when you're warm with me, then I feel safe with you. I feel, wow, Edwin, you like me. And so I feel like I can be myself, and I feel like I can reach out to you to solve problems. So that's a piece of positive discipline, is this warmth and structure. It's being able to communicate and being a feeling of love and warmth for a child, and also be able to communicate information about how does the world work? What do I need to know? So you are real safe for me as an adult if you provide structure, because you help me understand the world. And then the third component of positive discipline is to understand how children think and feel. And that is huge, right? Because I don't know if you've ever done counseling with a partner, ever done couples counseling, but I have. And it's an amazing experience, because often you go in wanting the counselor to solve problems. Fix my husband. He's driving me crazy. He's doing this and that, right? But you kind of soften into this experience of being able to build capacity to feel each other and to really experience what is it like to be in the body and mind and heart of my husband. And it doesn't mean I'm able to necessarily solve the problem immediately, but just that experience itself makes the world bigger. I feel bigger. And now I'm not just me. I'm not just what I feel and what I think, but I'm also really deeply aware of what he feels and what he thinks. And so things get bigger, and they're not simple. They can be more complex in that way, but it's a very soothing experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of parenting is about soothing, right? If I'm anxious, I don't have empathy.
Yeah, it's just a very active, that act of feeling into the experience of someone else. You might not agree with what's going on with them. You're saying like in a couples counseling,
Right.
but it's just a very act of trying, of doing that. That creates like a spaciousness and some sense of connection that itself in itself is nurturing and
It is. And for
creates some form of
children,
calmness.
it does, inside of us and also in our partner. They don't have to be so afraid. So much of problem solving is the last part of positive discipline, and rightly so. It should be at the end, because you have to first feel safe. You have to feel like you can get into the world of the other person. How can you solve a problem when you don't even know what it's like to be in the skin of the other person that you're trying to problem solve with, you know? And little children in particular are very challenging to understand their world. It's very, how long ago was it when we were that small, and their brains are less developed, and they're more sensitive in some ways and less developed in other ways. So it's a lot of work to try to understand, why are they acting that way? So empathy is a big piece of it, because if you can understand that, there was a study I was reading where if they asked mothers what they had an assessment to say, what are your interpretation of your child's behaviors? And they did it with infants. And they were questions like, if your baby cries, are they trying to just manipulate you? Or if the baby throws the food on the floor, are they just trying to make you angry? Or, questions that sort of implied negative intent on behalf of the child and the baby. And the higher your score of thinking the child was out to get you or manipulating you or whatever, the higher your own score of being aggressive towards your child was. So, of course, if we have a malicious intent, if we think that person's out to get us, whether it's a baby or a toddler who won't stop screaming in the grocery store, or won't stop throwing their food or kicking and having a tantrum, if we assign a negative feeling, we're less likely to feel into their world. We're more likely to think of them as a threat. And
So having that negative judgment of them or intent blocks the empathy. So what we're really wanting to do is empathize in and really find out what is really going on with them.
Yes. It's like, I think a lot of work I do with parents is trying to help them feel less anxious, like I understand, and trying to connect with them so they feel understood, and then helping them to become curious about, what do you think is going on inside of the child? But if the parent is so overwhelmed, then they can't do that. So that's my job, is to help the parent feel better and to co-regulate with them. And then when we co-regulate and we get into this nice state of empathy and co-regulation, then we can sort of ponder and wonder, I wonder what that behavior is about that's driving me crazy or making me overwhelmed, a chronic problem that we can't solve yet because we don't understand.
So they're in a heightened state of anxiety or stress, and you're like an empathic presence, willing to listen to them, to hear where they are, and that starts them to start feeling regulated or calm or heard, which gives them, I imagine, more capacity than to pass that way of being and energy on towards their own children.
Yes, and I think that's really the role of any helper, whether you're a therapist or a friend or a neighbor, or just you're in a restaurant and you see a baby acting up, or a little toddler or a little child acting crazy, and instead of being irritated with that situation, expressing sympathy for the parent and warmth and kindness toward the parent and the child, knowing that they're struggling. I think that's our task culturally, is how do we come from an empathic stance of, this is a hard behavior, but I really care about you. And I care more about you and your child than about your bad behavior that's driving me crazy. Yeah. So that relationship's so much more important, right, than just being comfortable or getting your way.
So in terms of comparing this, like, tough love or the behaviorist approach, which is, I just want you to do the actions that I want you to do. That's more like, if I scare you, you're going to do what I want you to do. Or there's like with Supernanny, you got the naughty corner, right? It's like,
Yes.
we're gonna isolate you, so it's using either fear or isolation or.
Yes. Yes, and I think part of her genius that she does right is that Supernanny, from what I've watched of her, tries to be consistent and predictable. So that, I think, is her strength, is that she's consistent and predictable, and so children need that, and really people in general need that, but children especially need that. But the unfortunate side of it is that she's going to get immediate compliance by using fear, but she's not really helping the child self-regulate, because she's not helping the child feel safe with her and understood. Although there may be some safety if at least Supernanny is calmer and more structured and doesn't get angry and doesn't lose control the way that maybe the parents are doing. So there is some level of safety. But in a way, Supernanny's kind of missing a deeper piece, which is how to really feel your way into the child's world and be an emotional, safe place so that the child can regulate with you. And that's kind of impossible for someone that just comes into your home for short periods of time, because it takes time to build relationship, right? It takes time to build deep trust.
Yeah, is that empathy that, people ask, well, what's the problem with empathy? And it does seem to take time. It's a time-consuming approach. It seems to be the one, in turn, I don't know if it's really a negative, but it seems to be one problem with it. But then I'm also, think of what I heard Stephen Covey, who did the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. Yeah. He says empathy takes time, but it's better to put that time in and clean up the mess that not having empathy kind of leads to for years afterwards, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting that empathy does take time. And if you're in an anxious state, it means you're disconnected. So you are having trouble experience it. There's not as much urgency. So some of the urgency, I think, is about the lack of connection, the lack of empathy, and the level of anxiety that one feels when you're not connected. And if you're not connected to your spouse or you're not connected to your child, then your level of urgency and anxiety is heightened. So in some sense, it's paradoxical. Because what you're trying to do is remember that you're in connection, that this is a relationship, this is a partnership, and you're trying to, be together and solve problems together, and you're trying to help your child. But if you feel alone, then your anxiety goes up, and then you try to control them because you feel so overwhelmed, and you're having problems with your own self-regulation.
So that's the question, how to, for parents to have more self-empathy or have that empathic support.
Yes. Yeah. My sense about it is, part of it is we really need relationship. You can't just conjure it up by just sitting quietly and meditating. I think some people benefit deeply from that kind of meditation, but empathy, I think, is a relational experience. And I think you need positive, consistent relationships that are rewarding and have a fundamental empathic component to them. That's why a lot of people go to therapists for years on end, because they were deprived of that kind of consistent relationship where someone really got them consistently over time. So as you get that experience of empathy over time, then you can integrate it into yourself, you digest it into yourself, and then you, in a sense, have that memory, so that when you're anxious with your child, you remember, I'm okay. I can do this. I can stay connected to my child because I have a memory that relationship is soothing, and that when we're connected and we feel each other, that we sort it out together.
Yeah, there's the notion of neurons that fire together, wire together, but there's also a deepening of those neural grooves. So as we do more and more empathy, that empathic connection gets deeper and deeper. I mean, it gets deeper ingrained into our brains.
It does. And, a lot of us have an ambivalent attachment to our own parents, and it informs the way we connect to our own children. There was an amazing study done, I think it was out of Princeton, that showed 4 out of 10 children have an ambivalent attachment to their parents. And that's quite significant, because that means that you are inconsistently able to trust relationship because you've had this inconsistent reward of, yeah, sometimes it's good, but sometimes it's really not good. So a lot of the work in building empathy is consistently coming back into relationship with your partner, with your child, where you go, okay, this is hard, but we're in it together, and creating safety for each other, which is why punitive ways of relating to children is so destructive to the parent, because it reinforces this feeling that I have to aggress, or I have to be I have to punish or hurt or fight or harm or control in order to be in relationship. And it actually heightens the anxiety of the parent.
It kind of
It sort of
what you give
reinforces
out is
control.
coming back. Yeah, it's creating a whole
It is.
dynamic, relational dynamic of that.
It
that
is.
stress. Yeah. Well, how do we compare that then, that approach, the kind of an empathic relational approach, to what I've heard of as laissez-faire, indulgent parenting? It's sort of almost like kind of by neglect, and oftentimes, kind of empathic parenting gets seen as that's what it is. It gets kind of confused with that form of parenting. So how does that relate?
Well, one thing that the research says is that punitive and authoritarian parenting does create more negative outcomes with children than passive parenting. So the first thing is that although I don't think passive parenting is a good idea, punitive, aggressive, authoritarian parenting is a worse idea, quite significantly. And I think parents that are afraid of losing control may launch a lot of judgment at passive parents. But passive parenting in the negative sense, I think, is a form of neglect. It's the inability to stay in relationship. It's the inability to say, this is what I need, these are my limits, these are my boundaries. And it's really the lack of two fundamental things. But one for sure is it's a lack of structure. So you're not giving the child information about the world. And it's also a lack of problem solving, because you're not solving problems with the child. So if you're quite passive, what message are you sending to your child? So I think passive parents are parents that are sometimes anxious or conflict avoidant, and also have relationship problems, and also have problems getting into empathic connection to their child, but they may be more avoidant than controlling as a way to deal with that sort of lack of trust in the you and me relationship. It's you and me together, solving problems in life, helping each other. So a passive response may be more what some people do who've been raised in homes where they were not encouraged to have a voice, or to say no, or to, that maybe they had an aggressive or authoritarian parent, and so they learned to be passive. So they're almost two sides of the same dynamic. But empathic parenting is not passive. It's relational, and it's very involved.
Well, what are some, methods, approaches, and ways to foster an empathic parenting? We already talked about one is just to realize that we already are in a relationship. So, to mirror neurons shows us, well, we're already in an empathic relationship, and we can do it better. So that would be one. What else?
Well, I think one is, one of the things we're really seeking is to create safety, emotional safety. And that's what warmth does, and that's what structure does. Structure meaning that you let the child understand what's going on, what they can predict, what the rules are, how things work, really helping them understand their environment. But to be able to do that, you have to be regulated yourself. So that, empathic parenting is based on this idea of co-regulation, that children don't have the brain architecture to really regulate. Yeah, they need your brain, and within the context of your brain, you help them co-regulate. You help them manage overwhelming feelings. You help them figure out if they're hungry, or if they're tired, or if they just need to be held, or they just need connection, or you mirror their feelings about what they're experiencing. You help them digest feelings. That's co-regulation. And so I think a fundamental piece is to be self-regulated.
Mm-hmm.
How calm are you? So in that sense, that's where meditation and yoga and having healthy relationships and lots of pleasure in your life where you get joy is so important, so that you are in a place of regulation where you can be there for your child.
So you're kind of like holding your empathic presence, and then that's kind of a model for the children to learn from, and have that.
Yes.
You're kind of like lending your empathic presence. I've heard that term of lending my presence to someone so that they can see themselves. And I can also see like you're learning that that's a way of being in the world. I can do that too. If you're calm, I can be calm too.
Yes, yes. Yeah, lending your empathic presence, and also telling the other person what you need. A lot of times that's hard for parents. It's kind of built on this old idea of sacrifice, but really,
Mm-hmm.
I think self-sacrifice is a quite destructive idea. Empathic connection means you have empathy for yourself as well. So you negotiate what things you're going to do. You tell the child when you're getting overwhelmed, when you need quiet, when you need a break, when you need a moment of reprieve. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many different blocks to empathy. I think you just touched on one too, is that well, I have to empathize with you, sacrifice myself. It's kind of like this one-way approach, and that's actually not the most empathic building, relationship building a way of being. It's that we want a co-empathy or a shared empathy or a neutral empathy relationship. So it's
Yes.
really about teaching
Yes.
empathy for the children and everyone in the family.
Yes. It's very lovely the way you put it. It's mutual. It's inherently mutual.
So the other was, it seems to me that there's, if we know we're already in relationship, but there's also one of the building blocks of creating empathic way of being in the family is to have the intention to want to do it. It's like we have to like say, this is what we want to do, and how are you seeing the people come to that determined intention that this is what I want to work on?
Hmm. Well, I think we all want to feel good, don't we? I mean, we all are seeking a way to feel good. And, when we're not in empathic connection with our children, they're usually pretty dysregulated and life's really hard, right? It's really hard. So I think, at least in my world, parents come to me seeking some new skill, some ability, because where they're at is so incredibly uncomfortable that they can't tolerate it anymore. And so, and of course, I've never had a parent come to me, I don't think, on their own volition, that did not absolutely love their child and want more for them and their child. So, um, there's the intention, is I want it to be better. And I
Yeah, I
think that
think.
we're naturally like that, aren't we? We want to feel good together. We want to enjoy our children. We want to have pleasure. We want it to feel good.
Yeah, I'm really inspired by the work of Carl Rogers and his work on empathy, and he had a comment about being heard. He said, "It feels damn good." I'm heard. So it kind of like comes down to that. Hey, it feels pretty damn good. So,
It does. It does. And, parents often come to me seeking that understanding, but also anticipating they won't be understood. That they come with their own injury around empathy, that, is she going to get me? Is she going to understand me and help me with my child? But then also this fear that I'm going to judge or in some way not have empathy or breach that connection, and then they'll be back alone. So I think, so many of us have been raised, partly because we are such a punitive culture towards children, that all of us had fundamental early experiences where the people we love turn on us in uncontrollable ways that we can't predict and we can't control. And as much as people say, well, he knew, he made a choice, I think the truth is that children do well when they can. And because it's always preferable. And so when they're not doing well, it's because they can't. And so childhood for a lot of us is mixed in terms of, can we get empathy from another person? Can we get support? Or should we just handle it on our own? I'll just keep doing what I'm doing because at least I have control. Yeah. So coming to a therapist, particularly for your children, is a huge step in trying to imagine that maybe you could have more empathy for yourself, and that this person that I'm coming to see might be able to help me, and that it might translate to my child feeling better and doing better.
So talking about like methods for fostering empathy, something I've been using in my own family is we call empathy circles. And this is where we have like a family get together. We use like Carl Rogers' approach of reflective listening. But we have the whole family, and one person speaks to one other person in the family who reflects back what they're hearing you say until you feel fully heard. Then it's the listener's turn to speak to someone, and we just go around. We've sometimes gone 4 hours of doing that, and it's really been quite amazing in terms of what it brings up. Because my family are very conservative, evangelical Christians, vote Republican, and I'm more the progressive side. We used to have all these conflicts. But really, the empathy I found is really the connecting ingredient. All that stuff doesn't really matter if we can get into kind of an empathic connection. So as a methodology, I found that really helpful. I've been looking at how to do that. Children, I don't have any children, but I have nephews and nieces, is how to get them to start learning the steps of having those circles themselves.
Yes.
Dialoguing and fostering empathy between themselves and do conflict mediation. That basic process is quite amazing in terms of the way it resolves conflicts in general.
Have you ever tried that process with your nieces and nephews where you do this empathy circle?
I have. They're quite young. I started with first mindfulness. We sit and we say, okay, now sit still, count to 10. We're all sitting there, 1, 2, 3. So I'm getting them to start. I'm trying to do little baby steps, and I say,
yes.
Okay, now somebody, what are you feeling? And one person does the motion, and then let's all mirror what we're seeing. Teddy or whatever do, and then we go all the way around. And so starting to kind of like create the steps for the children to learn how to do those circles themselves, but still have a ways to go.
Yes, it's a marvelous idea. I think parents do it a lot sort of naturally sometimes, but maybe out of order. Like, if the child's upset and comes to you and says, Susie broke my toy, and like really angry, right? And then the parent might immediately say, well, I don't know that Susie meant to do that. Or, they might immediately try to help explain what happened and why Susie did that. But I think the idea would be first to give this child empathy, your child. Oh, that must be awful, like your toy you really like, and it feels so bad to lose your toy, and you must be really upset with Susie, and you might be really angry with her, and and really get that experience. And when the child comes back into equilibrium and feels better, you can almost see they make that shift.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can go, I wonder what happened. Why did Susie break the toy? I wonder what happened there. Or I wonder why Johnny kicked you. Well, he got mad. I wonder what on earth did he get mad about? You see, because they feel connected to you, they trust you, that you're not going to forget about how they feel. Mm-hmm. So then they can take this little leap over here into Johnny's world, even though he's terrible and he kicked me. I'm feeling better now. Yeah, maybe he's stressed out, or maybe he has a hard time, and you begin to build a hypothesis about what Johnny might feel, but not too quickly and not before the child, like that stick that you give, like you hold the stick until you feel satisfied, like, okay, I feel understood. And if I'm anxious and I've had a hard day, I might hold on to that stick a lot longer.
Yeah.
I might need a lot of mirroring because I'm pretty upset over here. And then when I finally can breathe a little, then I might give that stick, and then I'm ready to show empathy for you. Because empathy, in a way, is a prefrontal capability, right? It's the higher mind. And so when a child's calm and regulated, they have access to that higher mind. But when they're not, they can't go there. So you have to give them empathy. And that is so amazing, the way that empathy regulates the system. It allows the child to come back into equilibrium, their breath slows down, they come out of threat response. And when they are out of threat response, then they can get curious. Like, wonder what happened that Susie's so difficult. She breaks my toys. What's going on there?
Well, it's also not waiting until that moment of crisis, but building the capacity and resilience before. So that's what I was trying to do with my nephews and nieces, to start creating some steps into learning those processes and that way of being, so that when the crisis moment does happen, they already have a set of tools.
Yes.
One, that they've been practicing, but also that they've been able to see the whole family sitting and having these empathy circles. So they've seen it kind of modeled. So it's creating a whole tool set to kind of build and foster that more empathic way of being. So those are some things I'm looking for. Like, what are
brilliant, Edwin. It's really brilliant, because one of the fundamental concepts about neurobiology is that if you want to develop the brain, you do it when it feels good. So you don't wait for Susie to break the toy to try to create this capacity for empathy, right? You do it when the child feels good and sees another child suffering, or sees certain things happening, or books you read where there's a drama in the book and people are having an emotional experience. Then you hypothesize, what might that be like? But I love your talking stick idea, because it's so interactive. It's not just cerebral. We're not just imagining. You're actually doing it. You're actually practicing. And I remember when I first learned to do therapy, one of the very first exercises that we had in grad school was I had to video record a friend, and my job was just to mirror back what they said until they felt satisfied. I couldn't add, I couldn't paraphrase, it was very limited. So interesting how hard it was. So it's a real muscle, right, to learn how to do.
Yeah, it's one of the best processes I've seen for practicing empathy. It's actually not a talking stick. We start off by setting the intention that we want to have an empathic connection. We light a candle to kind of hold that intention, so that has a little bit of a ritual to it. And then we start with, anybody can start, somebody reflects back, and then it just goes by that. And the person who, until they've been fully heard, they have the floor, and then they just relinquish it and say, I feel fully heard, and then it's somebody else's. And the family was really suspicious about doing, this empathy stuff to begin with. But then
it's a trick,
really,
right?
knockdown, drag out fight started a couple of years ago between my mother and sister-in-law. And I was able to kind of step into it and do that empathic listening with both sides, and then get them to start doing it with each other. I mean, and then the whole family gathered around there, turned into this whole big family empathy circle. And then everybody kind of ended with hugs, so everybody was, hey, this really works. So it's almost like it opened the door for our family. It was like a transformational moment. Yeah.
Beautiful. And it was familiar because you'd done it before.
Well, no, we'd never done it before. No, there was, but it was, in that case, it was a highly distressed, they saw the positive results. And then they were open to my sister and sister-in-law being willing to do it.
Yeah.
Then we started doing some circles around just family memories, childhood memories that were not confrontational. So then we moved into the non-confrontational. And so it's led to a whole series of these in the family. So,
well, it's interesting because there's a huge body of literature around empathy. The whole psychodynamic depth psychology tradition is rooted deeply in the concept of empathy. But what I find so interesting is that even the most liberal people and the most empathic people, if you talk to them about child rearing practices, it's as if they put on their most conservative hat and they become almost another person. And I think a lot of that has to do with recognizing children at a very deep level as human beings, as full human beings, not fully developed human beings, but full human beings with human rights, and thinking about, how do I talk to my children? Do I talk to children differently than an adult? I think in this culture, we have very little empathy for children. We will speak to children in ways we would never speak to someone we didn't even care for. We wouldn't speak to that way. And it's kind of a collective collusion around how do we treat children. And when we start to make that shift, I start thinking about this empathy circle and how do you invite children in? Well, part of it is you have to listen to them. You have to understand how they think and feel, and you have to pay attention to their inner world. And when you do that, they naturally want to please you, and they want to naturally be in relationship. And in a sense, we're, if we don't understand how they think and feel, we're missing out, well, on the fundamental joy of being with children, but also on their natural need to participate and to be with us in a way that's harmonious.
That they want to contribute. I don't know if you've seen those studies of showing children that if you're like struggling with something, little toddlers, they want to come over and kind of help out, and they kind of are having fun and enjoyment out of contributing.
They do. I think children, when they don't contribute, when they're struggling, it's when they feel threatened. So the more we know about how to create a sense of emotional and physical safety, I think the more effective we are as parents. And the less we rely on coercion and unilateral decision and power and control, the more safe our children will feel with us. Yeah,
so, well, that's one thing to look at is how to, tools for building that environment, that empathic environment. And then the other part is there's so much that violence and dysfunction out there. And that sounds like the work that you're doing with therapy is how do you heal from that dysfunction, I guess, for want of a better word, and heal, put people on, help move towards that more empathic path.
Yeah, I think the major work I'm doing in my political activism on behalf of children is to help adults reestablish an empathic connection to themselves as children. There's this amazing attachment tool. It's an assessment. It's called the Adult Attachment Assessment. And it really evaluates your connection to yourself as a child. How do you tell the story of your childhood? How do you tell about things that happened? Is it coherent? Is it empathic? And the more connected you are and sympathetic and empathetic you are and compassionate toward yourself as a child, the greater likelihood you'll be firmly and securely attached to your children. And the inverse is true, that if you have sort of, you don't have a natural feeling for what you're talking about, you may talk about really horrible things as if you were a robot, or you're just sort of disconnected from it, or there's not a sense of coherence, or maybe you thought I was just a brat and I deserved it. These kinds of inability to have empathy with yourself as a child is a huge predictor of how connected you will be to your own children. So I think the work of ending spanking and ending violence against children is at a very deep level about reconnecting and having a deeper sense of empathy for oneself as a child. So I often say we have to remember what it was really like to be little. And that's painful for a lot of us because we developed, if we had hostile, aggressive parents, a lot of very hostile ideas about ourselves as being bad, as deserving it, as being unlovable, as life being unsafe. And so really, we're just having to remember. And so when you have this sense of sympathy and mercy for yourself as a child, then you can easily extend it to other children in your life.
So you go back and really empathize into your own experience and see what was underneath all those experiences.
Yes.
And kind of retell the story, find a kind of like a positive story or a more connected story, or
yes, a less blaming, less shaming story, a story that says you were only 4, right? You were little, you were learning, you were trying to understand. A story that says what happened to me as a child really hurt. Some of those things hurt. They were hard. Really getting into your early experience and undoing the self-hatred. I often feel like people that I know that say I don't like children, I'm aware that they don't like themselves as children. They usually do not have a good memory of their own childhood. And so children in general are disturbing or frightening or overwhelming or irritating to them. It's really self-hatred.
Mm-hmm.
To hit a child is to reenact your own trauma. Whether it's spanking or slapping or popping or whatever it is, it's a reenactment of your own hatred toward yourself as a child.
Well, I saw you talked about the adverse childhood experience study, where sort of a ranking in terms of your childhood experience. I think on your TED talk, you said you had a score of 8, which was like quite high.
Yeah.
So it sounds like maybe this is what you've done for yourself. You've gone through in your
Yes.
own experience, and kind of maybe you're speaking from experience, your own personal journey here.
Yeah, I think I'm speaking from personal experience, and then of course my working with adults as well. Many adults suffering from tremendous adversity as children. But yeah, my own experience. I did not feel safe and secure in the world. I had a lot of anxiety, and the beautiful thing is that I went and did psychotherapy for many years with a talented, wonderful therapist who loved me and who helped me love myself, who helped me come into empathic connection to my own suffering, my own anxiety, the things that I get triggered by, the things that I look at and think, well, why do I have such a hard time? And that inquiry is so important, because then when you begin to understand, oh, of course, this is why, then you have more empathy for yourself, and then you can extend it to other people. You can experience their dysregulation, their behavioral problems, that sort of thing, and you can get underneath it and understand and have empathy, and particularly with children, right? You can remember how hard it is to be a child. It's very hard to be a child. Children go from crying and screaming to being happy and thrilled. Life's intense when you're little.
Well, it sounds like you're really passing that on now. That's kind of your life's work now, is just passing on that way of being.
Yes, I hope so. That would be a beautiful thing, to be able to pass that on and to inspire people towards self-love and love of others, particularly of little children. That's our future, loving little children. I call the first 4 years as the invisible years, because I think we don't see children. And it's the time that their brains are most rapidly developing, and it's really the most powerful time in a child's life. So if we can open our eyes and our hearts to them, it'd be a very different world.
Well, I think that's a good quote there, comment to end on. So I want to thank you so much, Robbyn, for taking the time to share your insights and experiences, especially about empathy with me.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, Edwin.